Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am joined again today by a frequent guest, my friend and fellow therapist and an author, Jay Stringer. Jay, it's good to see you.
Adam, it's good to see you. Great to be back on your show.
We are going to talk about the topic that we always seem to be talking about when you're a guest, which is your area of expertise, sexuality and our stories. And let's start here. In my experience, in your experience as a therapist working with people, we often find the following pattern. People have to, for some reason, get in some sort of crisis, sexual crisis, or experience immense sexual shame before they are willing to take the risk of looking at their sexual story. So that's the pattern that we've noticed over and over. What I want to ask you about is, why do you think this is the case? Because it doesn't have to be this way, but it often is. Why do you think this is the case?
Yes, I agree. It does not have to be that way. And it's one of those heartbreaking patterns that we see over and over again where people are given next to no sexual education whatsoever, and then they are expected to have this kind of masterpiece of sexuality. And once they get married or once they enter into the relationship that everything is supposed to be working, and then automatically there is some level of desire discrepancies that emerges. There's some level of infidelity or porn use, and so oftentimes it is that crisis that begins to open the door to the wider work of healing and growth. And so recently I came across a quote by a depth psychologist by the name of Bill Plotkin. And he's talking about the ego, but I think what he is saying is very apropos for sexuality as well. So this is what he says. He says, in contemporary Western culture, our egos often develop in such a way that we are both underdeveloped and overly hardened. If in our youth there had been elders about, they would have provided initiatory experiences to soften us up or crack us open. Without elders, the soul waits for or creates a trauma, something extreme that will loose the ego's grip on its old way of belonging to the world. So, if I were to apply this to sex, part of the way that I might rewrite it would be to say, in contemporary Western culture, our sexuality often develops in ways that we are both underdeveloped and overly indexed in arousal. If in our youth there had been elders about, they would have provided education and training to help soften us and usher us into sexual formation. But when parents, faith communities, and societies abdicate their responsibility to equip us, the individual or the couple will wait for or create a trauma or crisis, something extreme that will initiate a more passionate, embodied, and attuned way of belonging to one's sexuality. One of the things that I have found is that too often we label sexual problems, be that low desire, infidelity, porn use, desire discrepancies, as something psychologically or morally wrong with the individual, rather than seeing them as the very difficulties that highlight how little sexual formation or guidance that we've received. And so, given the rates of trauma, abuse, infidelity, low desire in the previous generations that have come before us, I think it's a fair assessment to say we have not had elders among us that have helped us to understand our own arousal, to help us to understand our sexual desires, to help us to understand kind of the ebbs and flows of desire that take place within committed relationships. So all of this, I would just say, leads to us being profoundly underdeveloped in the area of sexuality.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really want to emphasize is, like, for the vast majority of people, it's not your fault. Like, no, but when you're a 14-year-old girl, when you're a 16-year-old boy, there are very few elders. There are very few elders in our society that initiate boys and girls into manhood and womanhood. And so for many people, like the classic question is, what's the story surrounding getting your period? Like what, just pondering that question will begin to help you link your current sexuality with your past sexual story. Or for boys, like when you had your wet dream, when you began to develop sexually, like was there any conversation? What was the quote unquote sex talk like for you as a boy? Did you even get it? I mean, I have counseled so many women where they say, when I had my period, I was given a pamphlet like on the washer or dryer where I put my panties, right? Like the absence of elders means the absence of initiation, which means that sexuality is going to be unbelievably fraught, scary, and a lonely experience for many people because nobody's teaching us, hey, this is what's happening. This is what arousal is. This is what's happening in your body. This is how to make sense of some of the feelings that you have.
Yeah, and one of the things that, I mean, Brené Brown quotes this German philosopher. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he essentially says the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And that is so crucial to understand with regard to sexuality, is if you do not have language to understand what is happening inside of your body, the limits of your sexual world are going to be very small, and therefore very high capacity for a lot of secrecy, silence, and judgment, and therefore immense amount of shame in one's sexuality. So I remember reading just between the ages of 13 to 15 for boys, you go from something like 200 parts per million testosterone in your body to like 1400 parts per million testosterone between the ages of 13 to 15. So that is a very dramatic increase in testosterone, which is going to lead to a lot of desire, erections, sexual desire. And if you have no language, no sex education to understand what is happening in your body, and you are immersed in really underdeveloped and toxic sexual cultures like purity culture or others, you are going to frame that very natural increase in desire and passion as something that is evil within you, rather than recognizing, like, my body is actually doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And how do we work within that? Becomes the question. But when you have no language, no understanding, no elders that are helping you to understand all aspects of your sexuality and arousal and desire, it is such a petri dish to feel immense amounts of shame and just feeling completely unprepared for the sexual world that you're about to enter.
Yeah, so well said. And in the absence of elders, the only place we can look for guidance is culture. That's just, we're social beings. So in your book, Unwanted, you talk about two of the primary cultural messages that most of us received around desire. And your point is neither one of them worked very well. So what are they? And please comment on them.
Yes, so I would say the two predominant paradigms that we are stuck with at this point in time would be, I would just label it as a more conservative approach that is found in very faith-based communities, and it's a combination of what I refer to as lust management and obligation sex. So I'm stereotyping here a bit, but men are often, taught to view their sexual desire as something that is out of control, potentially dangerous, and therefore something that needs to be managed or suppressed. I know when I was in high school, we were in an accountability group, and that accountability group was, we didn't often name it as masturbation. I think it took probably 11 months for one man to actually, or one of my friends to say, you know what, like, my unspoken prayer request is actually that I masturbate. And so that was just one of those things that we would all kind of say, like, yeah, we have some unspoken prayer requests that we need to be addressed. And so it was this accountability and then some version of internet monitoring. And so the whole message was basically like, this thing is out of control. This thing is full of temptation. And so we just need to try and manage our sexuality. And then women were often kind of taught that they didn't have much sexual arousal or desire. And when they did, it was kind of this message that you are obligated to have sex because of the man's needs that you're married to. And if you do not give him sex, it's such a setup for him to use porn or to look elsewhere. And so it became this kind of very just obligation sex message that women were given. And one of the best examples of this came from a best-selling book, I think during the 90s, early 2000s, where the author basically said to women that if your husbands are trying to quit porn cold turkey, you need to present your body as a merciful vial of methadone to him. And so it's just complete madness that is going to set up, both men to be very underdeveloped. But then if your whole reason for having sex is to kind of keep your husband from stumbling, it's a desire killer in so many women. And so I think that's often what we find in a lot of conservative faith-based communities is there is this sense that like lust needs to be managed and then you just need to give in to sex to keep your husband from love. And all that to say, we are kept wildly underdeveloped in the area of sexuality. So that would be the conservative lust management obligation sex message. In the progressive communities, the paradigm that's offered most frequently would be that of a shame management. And so they rightly point out that there's far too little sex education in the world and lots of judgment that's part of one's sexual development. So on their very best days, they invite people to try and shed a lot of the shame message that they have been given, develop some level of curiosity for why they do what they do. But in my own estimation, part of what the progressive sex message fails to do is to really invite people to a sense of psychological development and a sense of integration with one story. So I came prepared with just a quick excerpt from an author that I have learned a lot from, a best-selling book. But I just want to highlight what this author says about this couple and then kind of unpack some of the what I find to be problematic about it. So they're saying for years, Danielle and Jonah wished for more erotic zest, but they colluded in creating the vacancy. Danielle had a real stake in keeping Jonah in a caretaking role and assuming he was incapable of roaming. By desexualizing him, she made him safe. And Jonah's problem was not that he couldn't sexualize his wife, it was that he couldn't sexualize himself. When I asked them to describe to me their erotic erosion, Jonah says, I just wasn't that into it. Danielle took frequent business trips, and he started frequenting the growing world of internet porn. And then it goes on. In his parallel lust life, meaning the world and porn, Jonah found escape from the constraints of the nice, sensitive, domesticated guy. I felt like I'd never fully developed sexually. For the first time, I could express myself unabashedly. I felt desirable, powerful, more than adequate, manly. I wasn't just a nice guy. I could be a womanizer and a cheater and a liar, and there was a major thrill in that. I felt bad, but in a good way. So Jonah then goes on to open up to his wife about his porn use, and they essentially, the couple brings one another into their personal red light districts. They start watching ethical porn together, and then they start going to get erotic massages together. And that's kind of the development, is that a lot of times I find this within a progressive sex message is that there's often some really important initial insights where, how is it that Jonah is able to become more of himself? He's able to express more desire. He's able to show up with more authority. He's able to show up with more confidence. But then often what is overlooked is what is his whole story with regard to being undesirable? What's the story of when his wife goes on frequent business trips, he cannot be alone by himself without eroticizing his loneliness? And so, nowhere in that particular vignette is there any invitation for Jonah or his wife to understand their story, to understand why they have made some of the sexual decisions that they have made. And so, all that to say, the progressive paradigm and the conservative paradigm, I often feel like keep people underdeveloped sexually, and they do not promote the work of integration, which is so central to understand that some of the difficulties that I am facing sexually today need to be bridged back to some of the unaddressed and therefore unresolved stories of our past. And that's the work, is to be able to build that bridge between the present difficulties, the present problems, and some of the family of origin, adverse childhood experiences that we have not engaged. So in Latin, there is this phrase that's known as the via media, and that's translated as the middle path. And so that's what I'm really interested in developing in this sexual conversation, is how do we develop a middle path that doesn't pathologize sexuality, but it also doesn't excuse particular sexual behaviors, but instead invites people to just a radical curiosity for why they want what they want, and then to have an uncommon integrity for who they are becoming. So, all that to say, my sense is that we don't need a significant crisis to become sexually healthy, but in our sexual problems, they are ushering us into a particular crucible that, if we honored that crucible, that tension, that difficulty, the madness of what we're experiencing, that could begin to open the door to the wider work of healing and growth that we really need. And that's the message that I want to keep coming back to, is that sex and sexual problems, if we are willing to listen to them, have so much to teach us.
The third way, the via media, the alternate path, at minimum, we can say this, requires looking at, exploring, being curious about how your story growing up has affected your sexuality as an adult in the present. And so, one of the main themes of your book, Unwanted, is that there's a linkage between your past in your family of origin and your present sexuality as an adult. So let's bring some curiosity, let's bring some kindness to exploring our sexuality as adults. And what you point out in Unwanted is there's always, I like this, there's two storylines at play in someone's sexual life. There's the storyline of your present sexual struggles. And let me just say this, asterisk, we all have them, okay? You, everyone, everyone has sexual struggles. Sexuality is not supposed to be trouble free. It is a, I like your word, crucible. It is the one of the arenas that is designed to grow us up as human beings. So there's the storyline of your present sexual struggles, which we all have. And then you say, look, there's also the storyline of your growing up experiences in your particular family that set you up and are influencing your present sexual struggles. So you make a linkage between the past and the present, and you basically say, look, take any present day sexual struggle or area of unmet longing or disappointment or addiction or whatever it is, and what would it look like to draw an arrow from your present sexual stuckness back to particular moments in your past story? And that's where a lot of people are like, okay, there's some intrigue there, but there's also some, what are you talking about? How do I do that? So, Jay, what are some of the ways that you've seen clients bring unaddressed areas from their past sexual story and understand how those are playing out in their adult life?
So, a couple stories come to mind. One client pretty recently, came to see me classic story of struggling with pornography, trying to understand why he hasn't been able to shake the habit. And then he told me, in the last 6, 8 months, it's been worse than ever. And I said, just that therapeutic question, like what happened within the last 6 to 8 months, a year? And what he told me is he said, my dad died. And that began to open up the door to just a lot of conversations about his dad. And he started remembering the story of being down in the basement with his dad and watching, I think it was like one of the bowl games over the holidays. And he said those were the best memories that I ever had with my dad down in the basement. And we were, we'd watch bowl games together, we'd watch sports, World Series, like so much of his dad and his relationship existed down in the basement.
Mhm.
And then he would often have to go to bed after these games, and then his dad would stay in the basement. And sometime around the age of 13 or 14, my client realized that his dad had a descrambler device connected to the cable TV. And so if you don't know what a descrambler device, it basically descrambles cable channels that you're not paying for. So the Showmax, the Cinemax, Playboy channel, and you can descramble it all and just have unlimited viewing access to it. And probably around the age of 13, 14, my client began to go down into the basement to watch a lot of porn and a lot of just kind of late night 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Cinemax type of films. And so as we began to work through this, he had a lot of shame for using that descrambler device. And the natural question to him was, did you buy the descrambler device? And he said, no, I didn't. And I said, well, who do you think put the descrambler device in there? And, it didn't take too much deduction for him to say, like, it was my dad. And so part of his dad's ritual was spending a lot of time in the basement watching sports and then going to porn. And for my client, that was part of the struggle that he had found, killing a lot of time watching sports over the weekends, occasionally watching porn. But then after his dad died, that sense of the connection between his dad was gone. And in so much of the grief with his dad, part of the way that his attachment to his dad was formed was not just in sports. His attachment to his dad, even though it had never been named, was also through that descrambler device. And so that just brought in so much grief for my client in the last couple months to recognize that, like, yes, on one hand, we have these really beautiful moments of connecting in the basement, but also there was an unaddressed sexual story that
Mhm.
his dad had set him up with the descrambler, and that became part of the bond, even though they had never talked about it. So that's a client story that comes to mind. I have another client that grew up in a pretty rigid home. She was a pastor's child and just it didn't have a lot of play. Everything was pretty serious. But they had a babysitter that would come over about once a month that would begin to play with her and, was pretty competitive, whether that was like Uno, Monopoly.
Mhm.
She had talked about the Life board game
Mhm.
and the where you get your car and the children and all that kind of stuff. So part of what her babysitter really began to invite her into is just competition and play. And so they would put her little brother down to bed and then the games would just continue. And over the course of probably 6 months to a year, that babysitter began to groom her towards more sexual experiences. He had exposed himself to her and had kind of built up a lot of desire for him, a lot of competition, a lot of play. And in the midst of a lot of that grooming experience, she began to feel a lot of that initial experience of sexual desire and arousal. And then the story basically came out that this babysitter had abused another family in the church. And then her dad found out about it, asked her if anything inappropriate had happened, and she said yes. And this guy was essentially banished from the community. He was, I think, about 15, 16. And so his family was gone. And that was part of what she was trying to address is like, on one hand, everything that was being labeled to her was that this man was, an evil in the community, but this man was also someone that awakened a lot of life and a lot of desire for her. And that led to a civil war with desire within herself of, this purity message that you're not supposed to be sexual. But then she was somewhat sexually aroused by the abuse that she was experiencing. And so, just, I mean, again, how does a 10, 11-year-old girl
Mhm.
begin to make sense of the madness of, on one hand, this is bad, but on another hand, I have more life, more engagement,
Yes.
more desire at play with this particular person? And that was the dynamic that she played out all the time in her marriage, which is why she came to see me. As she said, I have a lot of desire for infidelity, I have no desire for sex with my husband. And so that became that sense of, you know, receiving a lot of obligation sex, but it was always in the realm of secrecy that a lot of her desire began to develop. So infidelity became a place where, with a boss, with another authority in her life, she could feel a lot of competition, a lot of desire. And so, unbeknownst to her, her desire for infidelity was remixing some of the original neurochemicals of her abuse, and she was eroticizing it. But then in her marriage, she felt, just a lot of the same purity messages and obligation, and that killed desire. So that was part of my work with her, is kind of untangling, like, you have a sexual story that really needs to be addressed. So those are the two clients that initially come to mind, Adam, with, like, if you have an unaddressed story, it's going to play out in particular sexual problems. And that's the point that I want all of us to really understand, is that sexual problems have the capacity to serve you some way, because they are always providing clues to something that you have never quite addressed. And until those stories and those themes are addressed, you can expect problems to persist in your life. But if you want those problems to be outgrown, to stop, you have to develop a level of curiosity and kindness for everything in you that feels problematic, that feels deeply shameful, that feels deeply confusing. And if you can begin to dip your toe into the waters of kindness and curiosity, your life and your sexual life will begin to change.
It's so good. It's just so good to hear those two stories, because at the root of that second story is the linkage between sexuality and what I would say, I would really use the word eroticism. And by eroticism, I mean that which makes us come alive. And one of the things that you've often pointed out is that, and I'm going to ask you a question about this in a minute, is that sex is God's idea. It's God's gift to creatures, to human beings. And another way of saying that is God is very interested in us coming alive. And for her, the game of life, or the game of Uno, like the board game life, not like life, like the board game with this babysitter, she, in the context of a rigid, boring, strict home, the competition that the babysitter brought, the fun, the play, it was erotic, not in a sexual sense, but in the sense of it made her body come alive. And that is one of the things that God made human beings for. It is in the Latin, it's vitality. It's the word vitality. It's vital signs, coming alive. And
Mm.
so back to the book Unwanted for a minute. One of the things that you say that I really like is that, here's how you put it: despite the overwhelming grip of shame and guilt, I do not believe that sexual fantasies are something to condemn. And then you go on to say that sexual arousal is one of the greatest gifts God has given us. Eroticism, one of the gifts God has given to us. And we do not need to spend a lifetime annihilating it. And with that sentence, you're provoking and inviting the reader to ponder that maybe there's a better way than you made a comment about when you were in college. Like when I was in college, we had these things called masturbans. Okay, they were like these little freaking rubber bands you put on your wrist, and if you masturbated, you had to put it on your wrist so that the guys in your accountability group would know. So for 24 hours, if you had masturbated, you had to put this freaking rubber band around your wrist. I mean, this is absolute madness. But your point is, hey, what if God made sex? What if God made the human being to experience eroticism, life, vitality, fullness? And so let me ask you, why, in your experience, in your opinion, do many of us get stuck in a war with our arousal, with our sexual desire? And why do many of us respond to that war in one of two ways? Either by trying to kill it all, like shut it down, become, asexual as possible, or alternatively, just letting our sexual desire take us into places that we really don't want to go in our heart of hearts, but we don't know how else to be with our sexuality, so we just go wherever it takes us. Those are the two options. Like, help us make sense of that.
Yes, we live, I would say, in a civil war with desire. That on one hand, we know that our bodies are made for pleasure and for beauty and for connection, and so desire is responsible for all the best things in our lives. And yet, desire is also responsible for so much of the heartache that we have found in our lives as well. Like, to desire love has brought me my wife, has brought me my children. And at the same time, a desire for love has also opened up the door to a lot of madness and arguments and things that I have needed to confront about myself, and my wife has had to confront about herself in ways that it's so difficult to be able to live in that realm of desire. So, a lot of times people begin to feel this initial sexual desire, and maybe it brought them into porn, or maybe it brought them into infidelity. And what they see is that, it's kind of a 1+1 equation. Because I wanted this, it led to madness. Therefore, I need to learn how to just manage it and suppress it or shut it down. And that is a way that many people live their lives. So, one of the sections of scripture that I think a lot about here would be Romans 12:2, where it says, "Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I think a lot of times what happens for people is that they have never been given an invitation to understand their sexual arousal template, to understand the role of desire, to understand, like, why is it that I might be drawn to this type of pornography? Or why is it, in order to have an orgasm, this is the particular narrative that I need to create in my mind to eventually get to a place of eroticism or to surrender? And what I find is most of us have not spent very much time pondering, why am I aroused by what I'm aroused by? Why am I turned off by certain things? And so, in the words of a lot of sex therapists, they use the language of sexual brakes and sexual accelerators, that all of us have accelerators that get us our arousal going, our desire going, but all of us also have brakes that begin to impede desire. And what I find is that most of us have not really considered, why is it that certain things turn me on? Why is it that certain things basically begin to annihilate desire within me? And so part of my claim is that in the midst of the civil war of desire, it is far more psychologically easy to just manage it and suppress it, or to just try to prematurely liberate it so that you don't have to deal with a lot of the gray areas that exist in our world. Because I mean, our mentor Dan Allender, I remember one of the first classes that I was listening, I it wasn't a class I was listening to. I had just started dating my now wife Heather, and Heather was in his class, Sexual Disorders. And my father had left being a pastor and had come out to the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology to kind of start his MA in counseling. And so my girlfriend and my dad were both in that class together. And so I was waiting for Heather to come out, and I could hear Dan lecturing. And one of the things Dan said is like the bedroom is the noisiest room in your entire house. Your porn history is there, your past abuse is there, your mother is there, your father is there. Like when you are having sex, when that experience begins to unfold, it is full of characters. It is full of noise. It's full of so much debris that you have not addressed. And, that's the point that we keep making, is that the sexual problems and difficulties in our life are really intended to be able to create something of a crucible, but far more some context for us to kind of slow it down, to be able to develop a sense of, why is it that I shut down when this is happening? Why is it that I come to life here? So, didn't fully answer your question, but it's a very noisy experience. And so we need places in our lives, we need elders in our lives, we need books in our lives, we need podcasts in our lives that can really help us to resist the temptation to manage and resist the temptation to excuse your sexual life. And if you resist managing and you resist excusing, I can promise you, you are going to develop in ways that you have deeply longed for in your life.
And that's a lovely invitation, and it's very hopeful. And it also, the word that I think of is integrity and integration. Like your arousal, the things that turn you on, arousal structures, that's because you have neurons. That's just how the brain works. The brain is an anticipation machine, and the past and the present are deeply connected. And all we're saying is that that's not just true with regard to the way you relate to other people in the world, it's also true with regard to your sexuality. That's what we're focusing in on here. And one of the reasons we're doing this particular episode is because we want to invite folks to the 4th annual Sexual Attachment Conference, which is coming up Saturday, May 4th. And it will explore all of this stuff in much more depth. In other words, we will bring new categories, we will bring more clarification, we'll bring more detail to the overarching point that we're making today, which is simply this: your past sexual story is related to your present sexual stuckness. And if you believe that, then the next question is, do you have any curiosity and can you access any kindness for your current turmoil? And we all have it with regard to sexuality. For your current turmoil, and can you explore how that might be storied for you in your particular story? That's the core of the Sexual Attachment Conference. That's why we're doing it. That's why we're passionate about it. It'll take place over Zoom, just like in years past. And in addition to you and me, Jay, we will be joined again this year, just like we were last, by Sheila Ray Gregoire. She will be teaching part of the time. She's the author of The Great Sex Rescue. She brings another angle to this category. And let me just give an overview of what the day is going to look like. I'm going to begin by teaching about attachment. Attachment is very core, not just to how our brains develop, but to how we bring ourselves to our relational world, which includes our romantic partners. So, in the context of attachment, I will teach on what I call the big 6, which are the 6 things every child needs from their parents to develop what's called a secure attachment. And when I say secure attachment, all you need to think about is you have an anticipation in your nervous system that anytime there is rupture, which happens in all relationships, repair is inevitable. It will happen soon, and neither me nor the other person will have to compromise our integrity and our point of view to make that happen. Now, if those sentences that I just spoke are like foreign to you, that's probably because you, like me, have an insecure attachment. When you don't get the big 6 met from your parents, you are going to develop what neuroscientists call an insecure attachment. And all that means right now is that relationships are difficult for you. And you have a particular way of dealing with your longing for both connection and separateness. So that's what I'm going to start with. Then, Jay, you are going to teach a little bit on what, and also share a little bit about what we expect from Sheila.
Sure. I will be teaching a little bit about the role of trauma in family systems as it relates to setting the stage for a lot of unwanted behaviors. And Adam, this is probably implicit, but I want to make it explicit. A lot of the examples that I gave earlier about clients had to do with specific sexual examples. But I think part of what you're saying, what I'm saying is that, if you have an insecure attachment, if you are anxiously attached, if you are avoidantly attached, that is inevitably affecting your sexual life. And so that's one of the things that many people are surprised by in their marriages, in their own sexual development, is that if you are very anxious, you are likely going to be using sex in a particular way to try and attempt to self-soothe some of the anxiety. Or if you are avoidantly attached, or if you are married to someone who's avoidantly attached, they might remove themselves from emotional and sexual engagement. And so those are all themes that, even if they don't appear on the surface to be sexual, they are inevitably shaping your sexual life. So I'm going to talk about how trauma does that, some on family systems. And then in my afternoon portion, I will really help people to understand what's going on inside of their sexual mind from a neuroscience perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a theological perspective, and really invite people to understand some of the key strategies that are embedded within high desire, or out of control desire, as it's sometimes labeled, and individuals that are struggling with low sexual desire. So that will be my portion. And then part of what we are bringing Sheila in on is to help us to understand some of the cultural and systemic forces that are at work against our sexuality. Because, as therapists, Adam, you and I are very I think part of the way that I've been saying is that sometimes we see shapes when there might only be shadows at play, just because we see everything as a family of origin issue or which I think there's a lot of truth to that. But part of what Sheila will bring in is a lot of research from her book, The Great Sex Rescue, about just how do a lot of predominant, particularly Christian and faith-based messages really mess with sexual pleasure, sexual desire in marriages. And so she's going to bring just a lot of research insights. She's going to unpack some of the predominant Christian teachings about like how husbands just need a release, what that does to female desire. In other places in her book, she's talked a lot about just even sexual problems that we don't talk a lot about, like vaginismus or dyspareunia. When you look at a lot of the research articles that have been done, I read a stat where it's something like 41,000 scholarly articles are out there talking about erectile dysfunction, but somewhere in the range of 4,000 talking about dyspareunia. So back to that language, back to that sentiment that if we don't have language, we aren't going to have an understanding of what's happening in our sexuality. So Sheila is going to help us to unpack how did some of these problematic messages get encoded within us, and then really invite us to a pathway that really centers pleasure and mutuality in order to have really good sex and to really allow your relationship to flourish.
And we want to make this conference as practical as possible. Like, we are aware that information transfer can only evoke so much change. What changes the human heart is not information, it is engaging the particularity of how your brain has been shaped, which is to say, the particularity of your stories, including cultural stories, but the particularity of what happened for you when you were growing up through the lens of sexuality. So, after I teach on the Big Six and attachment, everyone's going to be given an exercise. I call it the Big Six exercise, and it is designed to help you ponder It asks some very specific questions, and you have to fill out this 5 pages of worksheet that can be somewhat emotionally daunting and arduous, because the questions are designed to invite you to ponder, okay, was my mother and father attuned to me? Were they responsive to my needs? Did they engage with me? And so answering those questions, even just pondering you as an 8, 10, 12 year old through the lens of these attachment categories will help you understand how you attached to your primary caretakers. And why do you want to understand that? Well, because it has a lot to do with how you show up in the bedroom. It has a lot to do with how you experience your sexuality. So you'll be given time to do that exercise, and I'm going to follow that time period of personal work and reflection with a discussion of triangulation and subtle sexual abuse. So we're going to talk a little bit about this whole category of triangulation. And all I want to say about it right now is that the essence of triangulation is when a parent looks to a child to fill some of their adult needs. Sadly, more people than you realize were required as children to function in an emotionally adult way. And we are going to talk at some length and in some detail about what that looked like, how that appears in your story, and how it affects you. That's just like a brief overview of the Sexual Attachment Conference. But before we end, Jay, because we're running on time here, this is going on. Just can you put a few words to, like, who's the conference designed for? How do I know if I'm listening? How do I know if it would be helpful for me to attend?
Yep. So we designed this conference for individuals, for couples, and for leaders. So if you are an individual that is dealing with some level of sexual shame, that you want to understand, why do I do the things that I do? Why is it that I continue to struggle with a particular area of low desire or struggle with out of control sexual behavior? We want to help you to understand your sexual story and why you do what you do. And Adam, one of the things that I heard you say recently about this conference was you said, "This is the conference that I wish I had in my 20s." And I would say that that is true for couples as well. This is the conference that I wish I had before I got married, to be able to understand, what is my story? What's my relationship like with my mom and my dad? How does that affect my sexual fantasies, my porn use? How does that affect the way that I relate to Heather? I wish I had so much of this language. So if you are a couple that is kind of tired of a lot of the evangelical manage it or just kind of be obligated to have it, and you want to enter a more nuanced understanding of this, we hope this conference would just be such a lovely and good, potentially disruptive conference for you all to really understand the sexual stories that you all both have individually, but then also the sexual story that you co-create together. We have had so many couples go through this and have spoken so highly of it. And then finally, it's that category of leaders that, as leaders, most of us have maybe had one class in human sexuality during the entire course of our training. And so just imagine if you were a cardiologist and you were only given one class in the human heart, you would not feel very comfortable being a doctor for people that are struggling with heart conditions because you have no training in it. And so part of what we need to do is to raise the standard, raise the bar for leaders, is that we have to begin to understand our sexual story. We have to develop the language and understanding of what is actually happening first within us and then with those that we lead. And so if you are a leader that feels confused, maybe perplexed about what to do and how to help navigate some of these waters, we know that this conference can really help you as well. So if you're an individual, couple, leader, we would love to have you attend the Sexual Attachment Conference.
It will be Saturday, May 4th. You can sign up or get more info by going either to sexualattachment.com or you can go to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and there's a link right on the homepage. So sexualattachment.com or adamyoungcounseling.com. Thank you, Jay. It's always fun to talk about erotic things with you.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Honor to be here.